Chapter 25. His heart softens. When Mr. Edward saw the word gold, a sharp glint flashed in his eyes. He narrowed his cold eyes, feeling that it was sheer madness for him to come here and see her. Even though he had indeed wronged her today, the fact that she was someone's mistress was undeniable. Thinking of this, he snorted coldly and turned to leave. But just as he turned, his wrist was suddenly grabbed. Mr. Edward glanced back to see the girl, possibly troubled by a phone ringing, frowning and her two hands gripping his tightly. With another snort, he was about to withdraw his hand when suddenly he heard her voice, tinged with grievance. "Mom, Dad, is there something wrong with me that's why you don't want me?" Her voice, light as a feather in the quiet night, softly brushed against his heart. It made Mr. Edward pause, his heart inexplicably constricting. In his mind flashed the image of the little girl from the orphanage roof, helpless and confused, during that torrential downpour. That question, she had asked it too. It was a question any orphan might ask. Yet he had never considered that this cunning, never-gonna-lose woman in front of him had once been such a lost child. "Mom, Dad." Suddenly, she began to sob quietly, her crying making Mr. Edward pause. She continued, "Have I done something wrong? Please don't hate me, don't dislike me, I can change." Her unconscious sobs, akin to those of a wronged kitten, were accompanied by her jet-black hair scattered across the pillow and the delicate, pity-evoking face it framed. She clung to his hand, as if afraid he would leave. Mr. Edward gazed at her, complex emotions churning in his deep eyes. Yes. Raised in an orphanage, she knew nothing, perhaps not even seeing anything wrong with being someone's mistress. Just like her words to Grandma, "No one taught me." Could he give her another chance, and teach her properly? As he pondered, he saw her crying even harder, murmuring, "Dad, Mom, don't leave me." Her emotions were running high. It appeared as though she wanted to make a change. If she bumped her leg wound? The thought made Mr. Edward extend his other large hand and awkwardly pat her shoulder, as if comforting a child. I won't leave you." Perhaps his words worked. The girl slowly calmed down. When she fell asleep again, Mr. Edward felt his shoulders stiffen, and he sighed deeply. The commotion finally woke the family doctor. He stood up abruptly, his eyes wide with shock as he looked at Mr. Edward. "Sir, I..." Mr. Edward's cold gaze silenced the doctor instantly. He turned back to see the girl sleeping peacefully on the bed, and he sighed in relief. The doctor approached quietly, checked on Ella, and then removed the broken needle, and said, "Miss Ella's fever has gone down." Mr. Edward nodded, then spoke in a lowered voice, "Go to the guest room to rest." The doctor nodded. But as he left, he felt something was off. It seems that instead of taking care of Miss Ella, he has gone to sleep, leaving Mr. Edward in the room. Chapter 26. What are you doing? Mr. Edward tried to pull his hand away, but found that any movement agitated the girl. So he simply sat in the chair beside the bed, staying still. The girl seemed satisfied. Her discontent vanished. Instinctively seeking the safest spot, she moved on the bed and suddenly pressed her cheek against his hand. The smooth sensation made Mr. Edward stiffen. He widened his eyes in shock as she rubbed against his hand. Her soft lips unintentionally brushed against his, sending a tingling sensation through his limbs. Suddenly, he thought of their first kiss. The faint, unique scent of a young girl surrounding her. Mr. Edward felt uneasy. For some reason, he thought of that night 8 months ago. The familiar feeling almost made him push her away. Finally, the girl found a comfortable spot. Hugging his arm, she fell asleep again. She lay on her side, curled up, her flawless skin and long eyelashes casting a shadow over her rosy lips and a small yet straight nose. Mr. Edward looked at her. Normally so lively, never thought she could look so well behaved when quiet. Morning. Ella slowly opened her eyes, her gaze meeting the magnified, handsome face of the man before her, which instantly roused her. She threw back the covers and sat up, only to find Mr. Edward awkwardly lying beside the bed. She widened her eyes in fright, the next moment. Why are you here?" She instinctively wanted to get out of bed. But as soon as her leg exerted force, pain surged, making her uncontrollably fall towards Mr. Edward. Thud. She landed heavily on him. Her nose bumped against his chest, causing a subtle pain. Ella lifted her head painfully, gazing at the man as he opened his eyes in confusion. She couldn't help but sigh. This man's body is too lean, isn't it? Not only was her nose hurting, but the hard muscles in her hand felt like iron. Thinking about it, she couldn't help but pinch it. This iron, it's a bit bigger. Curious, she suddenly heard the man's angry voice, "Let go." Hearing this, Ella struggled to get up. But her leg injury made her movements clumsy. Before she could stand, the man grabbed her shoulder forcefully, then pushed her aside. He jumped off the bed as if touched by a virus. Then, with a dark expression, he fixed his gaze on her. "What are you doing?" "Ella, shouldn't she be the one asking that?" She coughed, looked at the man. "Chief, this is my room." Mr. Edward stared at her, his expression inscrutable, then abruptly turned and walked out. Seeing his back, Ella pursed her lips. This guy is really out of line. But, why did it feel a bit off? The next moment, she suddenly realized what she was holding. She awkwardly extended her hand, giving it a shake. Then she quickly buried her face in the bed, covering it with the blanket. Oh my! How did she end up touching that thing? Chapter 27. Ask the chief first. Just a kiss and she was treated with such disdain. Now, she had touched his most sensitive spot. What's next? The mere thought made her heart race. At that moment, the door opened, and the family doctor walked in. "Miss Ella, please lie down, let me take care of your wound. Your leg injury needs rest for a few days, no strenuous activities." The doctor performed a routine checkup. Ella glanced around. Where's the chief? Wondering what he was up to now. Last night you wouldn't let go of his hand, he had no choice but to stay with you all night. I saw him go back to his room just now, probably catching some sleep. That statement shocked Ella. The first time she met Mr. Edward, he didn't even care about her pregnancy. So she always thought he was a cold-hearted man. But now, he actually stayed with her all night. A warm feeling suddenly surged within her. Yesterday, she was supposed to meet Sophia, but he firmly refused, causing her such severe injury. She was still resentful, but now, she suddenly felt he wasn't as domineering as she thought. "Ella, my Ella, how are you?" An aged voice reverberated. Ella looked up to see Grandma Mrs. Edward, supported by a nanny, anxiously walking in. Grandma Mrs. Edward rushed to her bedside, examining her leg. "How did you get hurt?" "Let me see the wound." Out of fear for Grandma Mrs. Edward's worry, Mr. Edward had strictly ordered that no one should tell her about the incident. Only now did Grandma Mrs. Edward learn of Ella's injury. As the doctor was changing her bandages, exposing the wound, Grandma Mrs. Edward exclaimed, "This wound is so deep. Does it hurt?" Ella quickly reassured her, "It doesn't hurt anymore, Grandma Mrs. Edward, don't worry." Grandma Mrs. Edward frowned. "A wound this deep will definitely leave a scar." She then turned to the nanny behind her. "Quick, bring the scar removal cream." At that moment, a sharp cry came from the doorway. "Scar removal cream?" Ella turned to see Andy, her face filled with shock and disbelief, then angrily said, "Grandma, that scar removal cream was a royal court item in the past. The formula is lost now, it's priceless. You're giving it to her?" Grandma Mrs. Edward quickly replied, "Andy, you know how effective that cream is. With Ella's deep wound, without it, she might scar. A beautiful girl with such a big scar on her leg, it's not nice. Just cover the scar with clothes later, what's the big deal? That cream is mine, no one is allowed to take it," Andy declared stubbornly. "Andy." Grandma Mrs. Edward frowned, "You've always been a good child, how can you act like this?" Andy was momentarily at a loss for words. She bit her lip, ultimately saying, "The scar removal cream is in the warehouse, the key is with the chief. Grandma, if you want to give it to her, you need the chief's permission first." This made Grandma Mrs. Edward hesitate. Chapter 28. Have you lost your conscience? Seeing Grandma Mrs. Edward's hesitation, Andy raised her chin. "If the chief agrees to let her use it, I have nothing to say. In the house, if anyone had the final say, it was definitely the chief." So using the chief to pressure Grandma was indeed effective. Ella watched the situation unfold and quickly said, "Grandma Mrs. Edward, it's all right. It's fine," as Andy said, "a scar on the leg doesn't matter." Although she didn't want a scar, it involved asking Mr. Edward for it. Thinking of their recent interactions, her fingers seemed to still bear that real sensation. She moved her fingers, her face flushing red. Embarrassment. It was really embarrassing. While she was hesitating, Andy already laughed. "Grandma, the wound looks big, but it won't be that bad once healed. That cream is so precious, don't waste it." Ella was about to retort when there was another knock at the door. The butler stood there, knocked gently, then respectfully asked, "May I come in, Grandma Mrs. Edward?" Grandma Mrs. Edward waved, "Come in." The butler entered, placing a jar on the table, and said to Ella, "The sir said your leg might scar, so he sent over this scar removal cream." Andy couldn't believe her eyes, staring at the cream. How could the chief give the cream to her? But the butler wouldn't lie, so Andy felt like she had been slapped, her face burning. Grandma Mrs. Edward smiled. "Mr. Edward is the most filial to me. Go back and tell him. Grandma thanks him on Ella's behalf." The butler nodded and left. Ella's gaze fell on the cream. Without asking him, he sent it over himself. So, had Mr. Edward's conscience finally awakened? However, Ella glanced at Andy, who was almost glaring at the cream. Remembering the jade bracelet incident, she felt that after Grandma left, Andy would definitely come back to fight her for it. So, she needed a plan to keep the cream. Mrs. Edward, Grandma, stayed a bit longer in the room before leaving with the nanny, her steps faltering. Andy snorted coldly, turned, and left. Ella waited in the room for Andy all morning. But to her surprise, she didn't come. Had Andy given up on the cream? At 2 in the afternoon, Ella was trying to catch up on sleep when she was awakened by someone shaking her. She opened her eyes to see Grandma Mrs. Edward's nanny, serious, standing before her. "Miss Ella, Grandma Mrs. Edward wants you to come downstairs." Ella nodded, confused, then was pushed downstairs in a wheelchair by the nanny. In the living room downstairs, Grandma Mrs. Edward sat there, her face filled with worry. And Andy, upon seeing Ella, rushed up and shouted at her, "Ella, Grandma has been so good to you, and you repay her this way. Have you lost your conscience?" Ella paused for a moment. "What happened?" Andy pointed at the table. "Look at what's there." Following her gaze, Ella spotted a handkerchief on the table holding some jade fragments. Wait, jade fragments? Wasn't that Grandma Mrs. Edward's jade bracelet she gave her? Chapter 29, Unspoken Embarrassment. Ella frowned, her face turning somber. She had initially thought Andy was after the scar cream, but unexpectedly, she was still hung up on the bracelet. Andy continued to berate her. "Grandma gave you the bracelet she wore for 30 years, and this is how you treat it. I know you harbor resentment towards our family for leaving you at the orphanage, but you shouldn't disrespect the intentions of our elders like this. No wonder you grew up in an orphanage. Your character is just terrible." Hearing the words "terrible character," Ella's gaze sharpened instantly. Grandma Mrs. Edward intervened. "That's enough, don't speak so harshly. I think Ella might have accidentally broken it." Being an item she had worn for so many years, Grandma Mrs. Edward had deep affection for the bracelet and felt heartbroken seeing it in fragments. "What do you mean accidentally? If it had just fallen, the bracelet would only break into 2 pieces, but look at it shattered like this. Clearly it was deliberately thrown. Grandma, someone like her, you still pour your heart out for her, it's not worth it." After saying this, Andy walked behind Grandma Mrs. Edward and immediately smirked triumphantly, staring at Ella. Where Grandma Mrs. Edward couldn't see, she raised her eyebrows at Ella, clearly taunting her. That look made Ella lower her eyes. Grandma Mrs. Edward looked worried. "Andy, say less, I believe Ella isn't like that." Even now, Grandma Mrs. Edward was still defending her, which brought a bit of warmth to Ella. She lifted her gaze, ready to explain, when a voice came through. "Sir, are you going out?" It was the butler. This statement made everyone turn their heads towards the staircase. Mr. Edward, dressed in a sharp suit, exuded an icy elegance. His imposing stature made the living room of the villa seem smaller. As he descended the stairs, the oppressive feeling in the room intensified. Seeing him, Ella immediately thought of what she had felt this morning. Her gaze subconsciously went to his crotch. Men's anatomy is different from women's, in that area. Ella subconsciously swallowed. Looking at it now, The size seemed different from what she had felt this morning. Even while walking, Mr. Edward could feel her gaze, making him think of the morning's events. Despite maintaining a cold facade, he felt his blood rushing to a certain part of his body. His lips tightened, his heart burning with irritation. He turned his head, giving her a deep, warning glance. Ella, who had been pondering the size, suddenly snapped back to reality. Their eyes met, and the air seemed to fill with embarrassment. After a moment, Ella quickly averted her gaze, her face turning red in an instant. She must have been out of her mind to stare at that part of a man, yet, her peripheral vision still scrutinized him. She saw him quicken his steps and instruct the butler, "Prepare the car." It was the first time Mr. Edward felt uncomfortable under a woman's gaze. But as he was about to leave through the door, he heard Andy's voice, "Chief, you're just in time. Come see what she's done." Chapter 30. Has Chief changed? Mr. Edward hesitated. He didn't know whether to leave or stay. "Chief, you must punish her severely. She's made Grandma very sad." Andy persisted. When it came to Grandma, Mr. Edward turned back, his icy eyes filled with doubt. What had happened now? Excited, Andy thought this small matter was usually not worth bothering Chief, but now he was right there. Chief always showed the most filial piety towards Grandma, so he certainly wouldn't let Ella off easily. Thinking this, her eyes lit up as she recounted the incident again, eagerly waiting for the drama to unfold. Ella waited for her to finish and instinctively looked at Mr. Edward. For some reason, she wanted to see if he would believe her. But Mr. Edward's expression remained impassive, his deep eyes offering no clues. So, did he believe her or Andy? As she wondered, she heard his deep voice, "Do you have anything to say?" Ella was startled. She had thought his dictatorial nature would automatically condemn her, but instead, he gave her a chance to defend herself. Was it because of what happened last night? Was he feeling guilty? But now was not the time to think about this. She needed to deal with the situation at hand. She cleared her throat, putting aside her petty thoughts, and looked at Andy. Andy snorted, "She'll definitely deny it." "I didn't break it," Ella stated. Andy immediately got agitated. "With all the evidence, denying it won't help you. Who says I have no way out?" Ella propelled her wheelchair closer to the table, picked up the fragment, and frowned. "Where did you find this?" "In the trash. The servants found it in your wastebasket while cleaning. They were about to throw it out, but since we need to sort the garbage, they opened the handkerchief and found the broken bracelet inside." Andy had her story ready. However, Ella immediately scoffed at this. Andy took a step forward, pointing at her. "What are you laughing at?" "I'm laughing at you for framing someone without using your brain. Such a low-level trick is just too childish," Ella retorted. Andy's face turned pale. She nervously glanced at Mr. Edward, relieved to see him still standing there, unresponsive. "Don't talk nonsense." "Nonsense." Ella pointed at the item. "How would the Edward family have such a shabby handkerchief?" Andy got flustered. "What do you mean shabby? This is silk specially bought from China. It's just that you're ignorant." Right, I'm ignorant, never seen such silk, don't even have any on hand, so where did I get the handkerchief to wrap the broken jade bracelet?" Andy was stumped. You stole it." Ella shrugged, sighed, her dark eyes filled with sarcasm and resignation. "Yes, I'm so brainless, deliberately breaking Grandma Mrs. Edward's bracelet and then stealing a handkerchief to wrap it, then to ensure it's not overlooked, I put it in the wastebasket for the servants to find. I'm just stupid." Her sarcastic tone left Andy's face alternating between green and white. Chapter 31. A bit adorable. Mr. Edward stared at the girl. Due to her injury, her complexion was pale, which only accentuated the deep and bright shine of her eyes. Even now, seated in a wheelchair, she wasn't sitting properly, crossing her injured leg over her uninjured one. Her hand supported her chin as she looked at Andy, her tone carrying a mischievous edge. Having received formal aristocratic education himself, he couldn't stand her casual, unkempt demeanor, yet for some reason, that annoyingly cute demeanor made him find her somewhat adorable. The thought struck him, and he was momentarily taken aback. What on earth was he thinking? By this time, Grandma Mrs. Edward had figured out what was going on. She slowly stood up, her voice trembling. "Andy, how could you do this? I've been wearing this bracelet for 30 years. Andy bit her lip, pouting, "It wasn't me." She wasn't afraid of Grandma Mrs. Edward, but she was terrified of Mr. Edward. She quickly explained to him, "Chief, it wasn't me. It was her." She was regretting it now. She had initially tried to keep Mr. Edward there to punish Ella, but instead, she had ended up shooting herself in the foot. Her domineering and incoherent mannerisms were as annoying as her mother's. Mr. Edward frowned, lowering his eyes, his tone calm yet unmistakably firm. "Then you will be punished." Before he could finish, a female voice suddenly interrupted, "What's going on here?" In the Edward family, Mr. Edward was almost the supreme authority. So, it was rare to see someone interrupt him so directly. Ella turned curiously to see a middle-aged noblewoman entering, looking somewhat disheveled. She had an excellent presence, her hair neatly styled, a smile on her face. One could not guess her age just by looking at her face. But seeing her almost identical to Andy, Ella immediately understood who this person was. If she wasn't mistaken, this person should be Andy's mother, the matriarch of the Edward family, Mila. Following behind her was a middle-aged man. Despite the ravages of time, he still exuded charm. This was Mr. Edward and Andy's father, Alexander. Over the past few days, she had thoroughly investigated the Edward family's interpersonal relationships. Mr. Edward and Andy were half-siblings. Mr. Edward's mother had passed away when he was very young, and then Alexander married Mila. Hearing Mila's voice, Andy immediately burst into tears like a child who had been wronged. "Mom!" She cried out and threw herself into Mila's arms. Mila tenderly patted her back, frowning beautifully. "What's going on here?" She seemed kind and approachable. Alexander stepped forward immediately. "Darling, why are you crying? Who upset you?" His tone was gentle, indicating he usually doted on Andy. If he didn't spoil her, she wouldn't have developed this shrewish and brainless demeanor. As Ella thought this, she saw Andy pointing at her. "It's her. Dad, Mom, she bullied me. You have to stand up for me." As she spoke, Alexander turned sharply, his eyes hostile, directly targeting Ella. Ella tensed her body. A sense of danger washed over her, making her feel extremely uneasy. Chapter 32. His Defiance. Alexander's gaze was scrutinizing and extremely uncomfortable. After all, he was Mr. Edward's father, and his presence was strong. Being looked at by him, Ella felt immense pressure. But she didn't want to show weakness, so she raised her head and met his gaze. In just a few seconds, she felt a cold sweat break out on her back. However, looking away now would seem like weakness. As she was wrestling with this, Mr. Edward suddenly stepped between them, blocking their gazes, intentionally or unintentionally. Ella immediately felt relieved. She then heard Alexander's cold and unfriendly inquiry, "Is this the daughter of your sister?" Ella bit her lip, sensing that Alexander didn't like her. Not knowing Alexander's standing in the family, she looked towards Grandma Mrs. Edward. Grandma Mrs. Edward seemed somewhat timid in front of Alexander. She weakly spoke, "Yes, this is Ella. She's been away for over 20 years, grown up now, just like her mother. We should bring her back." A single dismissive sound, unclear if it was acceptance or rejection. Alexander then looked at Andy, his attitude immediately changing. "All right, stop crying. What did she do to you? Tell me, and I won't let her off." Ella. For some reason, she suddenly felt a pang of discomfort. Children raised in orphanages are sensitive and fragile. This behavior of letting her parents intervene when she couldn't handle it herself hurt her deeply. Because she didn't have a father. Even now that she was home, she never knew who her father was. Her eyes darkened, and her hands clenched tightly. All of this was observed by Mr. Edward. He seemed to understand her thoughts. A man who usually didn't involve himself in household affairs suddenly stood in front of her, confronting Alexander. This incident was Andy's fault. His tone was decisive, carrying an air of protection. Ella was taken aback, staring at the tall figure of the man in astonishment. Meanwhile, Grandma Mrs. Edward quickly clarified the situation. "It really isn't Ella's fault." Alexander snorted coldly. "One should understand who can be provoked and who can't when living under someone else's roof." Ella clenched her fists tightly, stubbornly glaring at him. Did this mean she, Ella, was nothing in front of Andy? Andy slandered and bullied her, and she had to endure it. A feeling of stifling anger swept over her. If it weren't for her mother being in the Edward family, she would have wanted to leave immediately. As she thought this, she heard Mr. Edward's calm voice. It's okay for the people of the Edward family to be domineering, but not foolish. I hope she uses her brain next time she tries to frame someone. Andy, who had stopped crying upon hearing Alexander's words, took a moment to realize what Mr. Edward meant, and suddenly burst into tears again. Alexander's face darkened, but before he could say anything, Mila stepped forward. Enough, enough. Meddling in children's squabbles only makes us look ridiculous. Let's end this here. As she spoke, Andy protested loudly, Mom, why are you helping an outsider instead of me? Mila immediately approached her, lowering her voice. Andy, stop causing a scene. Don't forget, we brought her back for a reason. Chapter 33, Playing It Unconventional. Ella scrutinized the situation between the mother and daughter. Mila pulled Andy aside, lowering her voice to a whisper before saying something that, although unwillingly, silenced Andy, who merely shot her a fierce glare. Ella sensed there was something fishy going on. A flicker of doubt crossed her dark eyes. Questions she had overlooked began to surface in her mind. Why had the Edward family ignored her for over 20 years in an orphanage, only to suddenly bring her back now? She narrowed her eyes, a sudden alarm ringing in her heart. Raised in an orphanage, yet due to her profession, she was acquainted with the high society. Yet, sentiment was the thinnest here. Alexander clearly disapproved of her, Mr. Edward had never shown any affection, and Grandma Mrs. Edward seemed powerless at home. So, who had sent Thito bring her back? Her gaze fell again on Mila. Mila dragged Andy over, still wearing a friendly smile. Ella, this was just a misunderstanding by your sister, she was just teasing you. She then glanced at the shattered jade on the table. This bracelet actually comes in a pair, the other one is with your sister. Since this one is broken, let her give you the other one as a replacement. Andy frowned upon hearing this. Why should I give mine to her? As Mila tugged at her arm, Andy snorted coldly. Ella clenched her fists. Though Mila kept blaming Andy, there was no intention of punishing her, let alone having her apologize. She lowered her gaze, curling her lips into a mischievous smile. Offering to replace her bracelet now seemed like just a polite gesture, something anyone would decline to let the matter drop. But did they really think she was an easy target, someone who'd turn the other cheek after being slapped? She looked up, feigning innocence. Sure, I'd love that. Mila's smile froze, a hint of disbelief in her eyes. Andy's face turned grim instantly. What did you say? You dare take my bracelet? Ella blinked. But wasn't it Aunt Mila who said it was to compensate me? Does that mean Aunt Mila doesn't keep her word? If so, then don't bother, I'll just pretend she never mentioned it. Flustered and furious, Andy opened her mouth to speak, yet struggled to find the right words. Mila, in charge of household affairs, would lose face if she were called out for breaking her word in front of the servants. Yet, handing over the bracelet was the last thing she wanted. She bit her lip in frustration. Mila was also taken aback, never expecting the seemingly docile girl since her arrival to act so unconventional. She tightened her jaw, glancing at Andy and calming herself before continuing with a smile. All right, she'll bring it to you later. Seeing the pained and awkward expressions of Mila and Andy, Ella felt some of her anger ease. Alexander had been right about one thing. When you're under someone else's roof, you have to lower your head. But Ella, she'd eat anything in life, except for being taken advantage of. Chapter 34, He'll teach her. All right, you've just come home and must be tired. Go clean up and rest, everyone else. Continue with your duties, Grandma Mrs. Edward announced. Mila nodded with a friendly smile, turning to Ella with warmth. I'm a bit tired myself, really could use a bath to wash away the fatigue. Ella, treat this place like your home, come to me if you need anything. I'll head upstairs now. Watching her drag Andy upstairs, Ella felt a chill creep up her spine. This woman could adjust her emotions so swiftly and be so kind to her. Clearly, she had big plans. As she pondered this, she felt a cold gaze on her. Turning, Ella saw Alexander staring at her. I have something to tell you. Startled, Ella bowed her head humbly. Uncle, please instruct me. Alexander snorted coldly. Remember your place in this house. He didn't give Ella a chance to respond, looking directly at Mr. Edward. "Mr. Edward, come with me." Then he headed upstairs. The living room fell silent for a moment. Ella felt embarrassed. She bit her lip and clenched her fists. As Mr. Edward followed Alexander upstairs, for some reason, he glanced back at her. The girl sat rigidly in her wheelchair, her back straight, trying not to appear weak. A sudden discomfort stirred within him. Yet, he couldn't pinpoint what exactly bothered him. He looked away and joined Alexander in the study. Alexander first inquired about company matters, then brought up, "Have you looked into that, Ella?" Frowning in disapproval, he continued, "Raised in an orphanage, clearly lacking in manners. With her limited knowledge and superficial understanding, she'd better refrain from doing anything to embarrass the Edward family." Mr. Edward lowered his gaze, his hand tightening into a fist before slipping into his pocket, answering coolly, "The Edward family's reputation won't be tarnished by a foster daughter." Changing the subject, "You might want to focus more on Andy instead." Alexander paused. "Andy? I'll be going now, work to attend to." Mr. Edward interrupted Alexander's words, turning to leave. Leaving Alexander to watch his son's retreating figure with a sigh. This son of his was growing more capable by the day. Yet, their relationship remained distant as ever. Alexander sat there, his gaze drifting. He remembered, it wasn't always this way. Mr. Edward used to adore him, always rushing to greet him with a cheerful dad whenever he returned from work. But when did their father-son bond turn into this estrangement? As Mr. Edward exited the study, he seemed lost in thought. When Alexander had brought up Ella, all he needed to do was mention her rumored affair, and she'd surely be kicked out of the house. That was what he had always wanted. Yet, why did he suddenly feel the urge to cover for her? Even when Alexander criticized her lack of manners, the first thing that came to his mind was her past words. No one had ever taught her. If that's the case. He lowered his eyes, then decided he would take on that role.